new Warframe update Jade Shadows completely shook up the current meta with tons of changes to damage types, elements, and enemy factions. So, in today's guide, I'm gonna tell you exactly what has changed, what that means for you personally, and most importantly, which weapons and warframes benefit from the changes, but also which are now less relevant than before. Big shout out to all generous channel members who helped me keep the lights on. And now, let's jump right into it. Okay, here's how we're gonna do it. First, we'll go over the enemy changes, then the changes in damage types, to then conclude what the whole meta is gonna shift like, and finally, we're gonna list the warframes that are gonna be better with the new meta, and also those who will get hurt by the changes because they're less effective then. So, let's get to it. As you remember, before the changes, we, I think, had 13 different health types in the game, and that has been completely changed. Now, we only have 4 different health types in terms of enemies: red HP, armor, shields, and overguard. Also, whereas before, the damage vulnerabilities and damage resistances were based on the health type, so every enemy sort of had their own thing, now the strengths and weaknesses solely depend on the enemy faction, meaning that every enemy of that same faction has the same resistances and vulnerabilities, making it way easier to mod for a certain mission type. If you want to see which damage types the current enemies are weak and strong against, just go on the star chart and then in the mission overview window, it will show you the little elemental symbols indicating what to use and what better to avoid. And speaking of vulnerabilities and resistances, remember how before there were all different types of percentage values from +75 to -15 and everything in between? Well, that has now also been streamlined, meaning that if an enemy is vulnerable to a certain damage type, it's going to be a fixed +50% damage from those elements, as well as when they're resistant, is going to be a fixed -50% damage. And of course, if they're neutral, then there is nothing going on at all. Another big change that they made in terms of enemies is they changed the way that enemy factions work. Remember how before we had Grineer, Corpus, Infested, Corrupted, and then Murmur and all that other stuff? Now they went and subdivided some of the enemy factions into even more distinct enemy factions. So from now on, we do have still the normal Grineer, normal Corpus, normal Infested, normal Corrupted, just like before. However, the Grineer in the Kuva Fortress tile set are now the Kuva Grineer and have their own elemental strengths and weaknesses. Same goes for the Amalgam Corpus on the Jupiter tile set. They are now going to be distinct from the rest of the corpus. And the Deimos Infested, which you encounter in the Cambion Drift, they are also now different infested than the normal Star Chart Infested. Besides that, we of course have the Sentient, Narmer, and Murmur as distinct factions, but that was also kind of the thing beforehand. Again, if you want to know which of these new factions is weak and strong against which types of elements, just go on the star chart, hover over the mission, and then you will see it. Or you can of course go into the patch notes and read it there. I don't necessarily think I have to read it out for you now. So much for the changes in enemy health types. However, there was another huge rework, and that was with regards to enemy armor scaling. So let's talk about that for a minute. From now on, if an enemy has armor, their armor value is going to be in between 200 and 2700 armor, meaning the lowest level 1 Grineer that you can possibly imagine will always have at least 200 armor, and the absolute highest armored unit you could possibly imagine will never exceed 2700 armor. In terms of damage reduction, that means 200 armor equals 40% damage reduction, and 2700 armor equals 90% damage reduction. What this means is that even for very low level player, partial armor reduction to get the damage reduction a bit down will already be viable, as well as for high level players, you won't have to full strip anymore, because with just 2700 maximum armor, even partial armor reduction will have drastic consequences in the enemy damage reduction, so you don't need to get rid of the enemy armor entirely anymore. That of course means that higher level armored units are now way squishier than before, and to sort of compensate for that, the devs made it that from level 80-ish on, enemy health and shield scaling is going to go faster than before, so that now high-level enemies have less armor, but therefore they have more health. Don't worry, we're going to talk about the consequences of all that here in a minute. Let's first though talk really quick about the shield changes. I'm going to put it on screen for you right now, but I don't think I should say all too much about it, because while all of this sounds really interesting, in reality, and I hate to say this, all of this does not matter because we're still just gonna use Toxin as we did before to completely ignore the shields, meaning for Corpus, pretty much business as usual. Oh yeah, and by the way, if you could maybe spare a like, that would be absolute sugar because, you know, I say it all the time, YouTube algorithm, blah blah blah, so I stop rambling right here and just say thank you so much for your support, and let's now talk about the next topic. Alright, so much for the changes to enemy factions, enemy types, and health altogether. Let's now talk about the changes in elements or damage types if you so want, because there were quite some as well. For example, Blast, a status type that we previously tried to avoid as much as we can, is now actually pretty viable. What Blast does now on status effect is, it triggers a delayed explosion which deals a fraction of the damage that the shot which inflicted the Blast status effect dealt to the enemy, and if you manage to get it all the way up to 10 Blast stacks, then it will go and sum up all the damage from those 10 shots and deal more than 100% of that combined damage in a 5-meter explosion. In other words, if you manage to group up enemies and then have a high status chance, high damage blast weapon, you can create sort of a chain reaction similar to the ultimate of Corvex. However, I will look deeper into that and do some more testing and then put out a dedicated guide talking about all the damage types in the game again, just like I did last year. Next, we got a buff to Cold. Cold before was already good, you know, making enemies take more crit damage from you while at the same time slowing them down. But now Cold is even stronger because now you can apply up to 10 Cold status effects, and when an enemy receives 10 Cold status effects, they will be completely frozen and the bonus crit damage that they take will be doubled when they are permanently frozen. This means that Cold is probably now one of the meta elements that you want to prime the enemies with because A, frozen enemies can't attack you, so that's great for survivability, and B, taking even more crit damage from you? Well, sign me up for that. Next, we got a little change to gas, nothing in terms of damage or anything, but the status effect, you know, the gas cloud, is now more visible so you can actually see if you run into one. And finally, magnetic, one of these status effects that we also avoided at all costs before, has gotten a ton of buffs as well, which in my opinion still doesn't really make it good overall, but at least it makes it viable in certain scenarios. Here's what I mean. First off, magnetic will now deal more damage to nullifier bubbles. That is already nice. However, what's more important is that it will now not only deal bonus damage against shields, but also against overguard, meaning having a secondary weapon which could theoretically shred overguard with magnetic might be a viable choice going forward. And what's more, when an enemy shield or overguard completely breaks, then the enemy will get additional electricity status damage for a percentage of the max shield and overguard that they had per magnetic proc that was applied to them. And also, one of the Zap Zap electric status effects will be force procced once that happens. Alright, now that was a whole lot of input, a whole lot of talking, but what exactly is the effect of all those changes on the meta in day-to-day gameplay? Let's talk about that right now. First, and most importantly, with the drastic nerf of enemy armor, partial armor stripping is now not only viable, but I personally think meta. So even in the absolute highest level content, I think it won't be necessary anymore to 100% reduce enemy armor, especially given the fact that now the damage runner abilities are across the entire enemy faction, right? Which is, by the way, also why I think having one Tau Forged Green Shard and then reducing armor with Corrosive by 98% is going to be objectively superior to having 2 normal greens and full stripping with that. Also talking about armor, I think the armor changes were an indirect buff not only to corrosive but also to heat, because now that the enemy armor is capped, inflicting a heat status effect which cuts enemy armor in half is also going to have a noticeable impact in enemy damage resistance. However, as nice as all of this sounds, there is also a downside to this. And that is that now that the enemy armor is weaker, as I previously said, enemy health scaling is going to be faster, meaning enemies have more HP. And the result of that is that damage over time effects, specifically Slash, now, while their damage wasn't touched at all, still take longer to kill the enemy because there is more enemy health to bleed away. When it comes to Slash, and in general damage over time, I want to make one thing very clear though. while Slash against highly armored targets was an absolute must before the update, now it isn't anymore. However, and I want to make this very clear because a lot of comments don't seem to understand this, Slash was not nerfed. I know I put a video out 2 days ago where I said, well, something is wrong with Slash. That bug has been fixed in the meantime, so now Slash still works as before. But yeah, if you go up against armored units, you can still go for Slash. Slash will still ignore the armor. The bleeds will still be as strong as they were before, just that the time to kill with those bleeds will be a bit longer because the enemies now have more HP. Yes, that means Slash isn't as busted as before anymore, but it still means that Slash is perfectly viable even going forward. However, speaking about damage over time having a longer time to kill, there is one exception, and that again would be the heat damage over time, because in contrast to Slash, heat damage over time does not ignore enemy armor, meaning heat DOTs benefit from lower enemy armor, which is nice because, as I just said, heat also halves the enemy armor. That means that going forward, heat DOT is actually going to be stronger than heat DOT before the update. But yeah, so much about damage over time. I hope I could clarify that, right? Slash, while yes, taking a bit longer to kill, is still perfectly viable. Heat DOT is now even better, and in general, going forward, partial armor reduction through corrosive, through skills, whatever, plus dealing direct damage to the enemies will be also a comparably viable tactic, which I think will lead to much more build variety. However, I don't think you will have to mix up your current builds at all because they're still all going to be pretty fine. One thing that I think we will see more, as I also teased beforehand, is cold priming will be even more important than it was before. Blast, I think, will be great, especially on setups where the playstyle revolves around grouping up a lot of enemies, so you can create those nice blast chain reactions, especially if you also reduce the enemy armor. As for magnetic, I personally think it will be mainly used for overguard stripping in higher level content. As for Corpus, you could, if you wanted to, use magnetic and benefit from all the changes that they made to shields and how magnetic is going to interact with that and all that stuff. It's definitely going to be better than before, but if we're going to speak purely meta, then there shouldn't be any meaningful differences to Corpus because Toxin is still king, even a bit more than before if I think about it, because beforehand, Armored and Robotic Corpus even had a slight resistance to Toxin damage, and since the faction resistances have now been changed, to the stronger Corpus out there, you will deal even a bit more Toxin damage than before. But alright, so much for the overall analysis of the new meta from my side. Please let me know in the comments down below if I missed anything important. But let's now take a look at what that actually means for our favorite Warframes, which ones are going to be stronger moving forward, and which will be a bit less relevant due to the elemental changes. Let's start with the buff Warframes that directly or indirectly are stronger than before. And first of all, we naturally got to talk about corrosive Warframes. Since partial armor reduction is now going to be meta, Warframes that can dish out corrosive status effects to reduce enemy armor are going to be much stronger than before, because now you don't need those green Archon shards anymore for full armor stripping. Meaning that specifically Seren, who with her spores can deal corrosive to the entire room, is gonna be so much more effective in higher level content than she was before, which is, by the way, also why in my recent Seren build, I installed a Tau Forged green shard with the changes already in mind. But then of course frames like Hydroid, naturally also great, dealing a lot of corrosive, and even my boy, Sandyman and Aros, who since his rework can also spread corrosive decently well, will be more effective in higher level content due to the fact that partial armor stripping is a thing. Same goes, by the way, for all primer weapons and all high status chance weapons that deal corrosive. You can also perfectly use them for armor stripping going forward. It's gonna be a nice thing. One category of frames that is also going to be super duper great going forward are naturally the cold frames, because freezing enemies is now a thing, and the absolute king when it comes to cold frames would be not Frost. Let's first talk about Gauss. This update had so many indirect Gauss buffs that it elevated him definitely into the top 5, but maybe even into the top 3 Warframes in the game right now. Given the fact that his Thermal Sunder can AoE insta-freeze enemies, means that Gauss players now don't have to worry about incoming damage at all anymore, all while at the same time dealing even more crit damage with their gun. And that's of course not all. Remember how I just praised heat for being better than before? Well, with Thermal Sunder, Gauss can also deal heat and benefit from that. And as if that's not enough, if you cast Thermal Sunder Cold and then Thermal Sunder Heat, you will deal Thermal Sunder Blast, which, guess what? Blast was also big time buffed. I know it sounds like I'm exaggerating a lot here, and maybe I am, but Gauss, one of the best Warframes already, now got a significant increase in power with that update, and I think we're gonna have a lot of fun with him. By the way, if you want to have a nice Gauss build, I already have a video on that. But now, let's also talk about my boy Frost. Frost has been flying under the radar for quite a while, because, let's be honest, he's a very old Warframe and he didn't age well. This update though not only brought buffs to Cold, but also a complete Frost rework, which I'm not gonna jump too deep into right now because I want to make a dedicated Frost video next week or so. By the way, leave us up for that if you don't want to miss it. But to make it very short, Frost can now also, similar to Gauss, deal massive cold AoE, permafreeze enemies, and benefit from all those crit damage buffs. Same goes, by the way, also for Lavos, not only because he can dish out cold, but, you know, he's a very much highly into elemental stuff Warframe, and with all the changes, he will perform nicer than before too. Next category of indirectly buffed frames would be heat-based frames. Remember how I said that through partial armor reduction, cutting armor in half with a heat status effect is now also going to be noticeable? Well, naturally that's going to be great for all the Warframes out there who deal heat damage and inflict heat status effects. First and foremost, of course, the Queen, Ember. While yes, she hasn't gotten her most important buff just yet, she also got a partial rework with this update, which I'm also going to jump into with a dedicated Ember guide. But to make it short, yes, Ember dealing heat will be better than before. Same goes, by the way, for Neja, and most importantly, Protea as well, because while yes, theoretically, damage over time is now going to have a longer time to kill, as I said, heat damage over time is an exception to that because of the armor reduction, and let's be real, they're not going to live long enough to die from the heat damage over time. Another category that is going to be very fun to play, and probably also much stronger, is frames that can benefit from the blast buff. And while quite some Warframes can do blast in some way, what is important to note here is, if they want to benefit from blast, then they need to deal big blast damage, plus they need to enforce status effects. Otherwise, the outcome is not going to be as noticeable. And talking about that, first and foremost, the brand new Warframe Jade, about which I, by the way, also have a video. Her exalted weapon can be modded into blast, and if you combine that with nice grouping, you're going to see some really funky results. And one frame that I could imagine would be super broken, haven't tried it out myself yet though, but I will, and that would be Zephyr. You know, if you have a ton of enemies flying in your tornadoes, and then you deal blast damage into the tornadoes, and those tornadoes deal the blast to all the enemies within them, then you're gonna create an absolutely mental chain reaction of blast explosions. I can't wait to try it out. But now, let's talk about the unfortunate few Warframes that I think didn't benefit at all from the changes and even got a little bit worse. And guess what? Those all fall into the same category, and that will be Warframes who are mainly focused around dealing slash damage and bleed damage over time effects. First and foremost, if you, for example, went for Kullervo and have a build that focuses solely around his ultimate, which, you know, lets the daggers rain and they deal slash damage and stuff, you will find that that now takes a little bit more time to kill. Same thing, by the way, goes unfortunately for Dante, because he is also revolved mostly around dealing nuke slash damage, and as I've said multiple times, while slash is still perfectly viable, and by the way, this goes for all the slash Warframes, right? They are still viable, they're not trash now, they deal exactly the same damage as before, but as a nature of the higher HP, bleed damage over time effects are now going to take a bit longer to kill enemies. So yeah, Kullervo, Dante, and all other Warframe weapon builds that are focused around bleed damage over time, that is still good, but it's a bit weaker in comparison to before because the enemies now have more health. So in my personal opinion, overall, the changes were really good because a lot of Warframes benefit from it, and even though slash takes a bit more time to kill now, I still think it's in a great spot. If you enjoy slash builds, no matter if it's on weapons or Warframes, I still think you're gonna have a good time with the game going forward. By the way, one quick disclaimer here. Of course, there are a lot of mini changes, a lot of mini interactions, how certain Warframes kind of, sort of, in certain situations benefit or not benefit from the changes, but this video is supposed to focus on the most impactful ones. If you feel like I left out something that you think is very important, then definitely let us all know in the comments down below. And if you haven't seen it yet, then definitely also check out my full breakdown of the brand new Warframe Jade right here. Another big shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Cell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nost Linux Gaming, Lycan Shepherd, Turtlepeer, Pepperwolf, OnnaKanye2, MissFireDX, StreamJet21, SignUpKing5000, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.